Okay, so we've decided to talk about how, and this has come up in the class a few times and in discussions that I've had with people outside of the classroom, as to how the ideas that are being presented to us and the concepts and the presentations that we've had, how do we bring that into a classroom when we have students from the age of 5 up into grade 9, and how do you, and what do you bring into the classroom, and how do you frame that so that you're comfortable and the students are comfortable with that. So.
I think one thing that I have thought about recently is, it's actually the title of a book, which I haven't read yet, but a book that my mom showed me is called Fact, Not Fear, and I think just that sentence has been resonating with me, in that I think it's good to make students aware of issues that are happening either in our own community or globally, like water or poverty, but not to cause them to be fearful. I don't think and that's something I've just been thinking about a lot, because I think there are ways that these issues could be brought into a classroom which would make students fearful or anxious or even feel threatened. But that's not the point of what we're trying to do with teaching social skills.
Yeah, I was thinking about that. I think it was last night or early this morning when I was reading some posts and thinking about this idea of ignorance, but also the feeling that there's so much happening and there's so many things that we feel pressured to be involved in or to do something about. And that can be overwhelming for an adult, let alone a child. And I think one of the things that I think is important and that I kind of want to bring into it is that as long as we're not ignorant, as long as we're open to the fact that these things exist and that these issues are out there, and that we're willing to be open and listen and possibly, if we're able, do something about them, but at least we're not ignorant to the fact that they exist and just saying that, well, I can't deal with this, I'm overwhelmed, I'm just going to blanket, cross it out.
Yeah, knowing that you're not going to fix every problem or maybe even any problem, but just focusing on one thing as a class, like what's really important to us this year at this age group or with our community, what do we want to work on? And even just working towards a solution, not necessarily finding a solution, but just helping out and just having that awareness as well.
I think also making kids comfortable with the idea that there isn't always a concrete solution or a way to solve a problem today, or like you're not going to be able to fix everything, but a whole bunch of people taking small steps towards fixing problems, or just even problem solving or brainstorming as a class. What are different ways you can approach that? What can we do? What can we inspire other people to do? And talking about just like in the future how they might develop and grow things, and like looking at projects that have been started on a really small scale and have become something bigger, I think can be inspiring for kids so that they don't feel hopeless when they're presented with a lot of these problems.
I think giving them options to start with too, because I think often when I think of social justice in the classroom, my own experiences, you're presented with all these brilliant things people have done, and you feel like you have to do something brilliant too, or you have to come up with something new, come up with something big, and then it's like, that's not the case. Like, you can start by joining something that's already been established and like contributing that way, start with something small, and then I think having those little successes is so necessary.
Yeah, and give resources as well. Like, where can you go to find help, and if you have an idea, like what to do with that idea.
It's interesting that you mentioned joining something that's already been started, because in that video we watched for Transformative Inquiries, I don't know if everyone watched it, it was the head of American Psychological Association, and he was talking about the life with the greatest meaning is that person who is engaged in something greater than themselves, which I thought was interesting. So there's a connection to that as well.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I struggle with in discussing all of these topics is the complexity, and issues like water and its use. On one hand, is very simple and like, oh, it all should be protected. But on the other hand, is very, very complex, because you have so many different stakeholders all trying to control a limited amount of resources, and to come at it, the whole issue from a fair and unbiased perspective is very difficult. I mean, so each side of the discussion, it's so much based on a political manifesto and an ideology behind it, and trying to impart that kind of complexity to students along with ways to make things better and things that they can do in their own life is very complicated and challenging.
I think of the word, when you said unbiased, I got thinking about when Stacey first introduced the company and was talking about companies that go in, or not necessarily companies, but people who are on the sort of negative side, and I'm missing the word that he used, but that have to say that they're going to fight. Oh, yeah, so if someone's doing something bad, they're going to fight against the bad that's happening. But then if that person changes, that organization or that person who's working against the bad part of what they've done no longer has a valid argument, because what those people are doing is now good, and their whole argument against what was happening is because it was bad.
Yeah, so not being anti, but being
Exactly.
pro the other side of it.
Exactly.
Which I think also goes back to what Tom was saying about all the big companies, because a lot of the time people protest and they're like anti, but if they actually had people coming in with a, hey, look, here's actually a solution possibly that you could work towards the problem. And yeah, you might not be making quite as much money, but it's something that's sustainable, and you can jump on board with this rather than just being like, stop doing what you're doing.
Yeah, like issues like globalization are so vast and broad and mean so many things to so many different people. But at times I feel like in our courses we're expected to view globalization from a left-leaning position, that it is all bad, and that really takes away all the massive number of benefits that it has brought across the globe. And yet there are some problems, just like in everything in the planet. Not everything is 100% good and whole and pure. That does not exist. And globalization has created some problems, but it's also alleviated a lot of other ones. And I just want students to, be able to think for themselves and be able to see that. And, you have to have some balance in what you're willing to take. And that's kind of what, Canada as a country is like. We've decided that we like a lot of the benefits, and we like to protect some rights, but other rights we're not too worried about. And as a country, that's what we have gone along with. So in individual lives, it's very complicated waters to navigate, I think. And globalization is bad. That is, to me, is such an ignorant statement. But for some people, that's a manifesto and a rallying cry.
Well, and sometimes the hatred is used to propel them forward in whatever cause they're. I know. I was looking at some quotes by Nelson Mandela and reading some of his stuff, and his one of his famous quotes is that he said when he walked out of those gates, he had to leave the hatred behind, because otherwise he would still be angry, and he wouldn't be able to do the work that he did if he had that hatred, even though what had happened to him was justified to feel that way. But he knew that if he carried that with him, he wouldn't be able to do what he needed to do, and be able to see the good in what was happening and the good in people. So that's pretty powerful.
And I think that's a really important message to pass on to children, like not just painting one picture about a situation or just seeing just the negatives, but really bringing out those positives, because otherwise people can tend to fall into the kind of like hopelessness, or like, oh, it's much more overwhelming. Whereas if you like see these positives, or even disconnect yourself a bit from the negatives, so you can work towards a solution.
It was kind of like when he was sharing a story about Reverend Al, about him living in poverty growing up, and that he was clear to emphasize that it wasn't all sad, it wasn't all depressing. Like they had a lot of happy laughs and everything too. And I think that's something we forget too, is that these people still do have a life to enjoy, and it's not all like depressing either.
Yeah.
It's like having too much of a positive is bad, but having too much of a negative is bad too.
Very
Finding that
complicated
balance.
stuff.
Very
Very
like
complicated
finding that
stuff.
balance is always like.
Yeah.
I remember you wrote a post on like finding a balance, and then
It's hard.
It's hard.
It's difficult.
We'll stick with
It's
it.
tough.
Though.
Yeah.
Yeah.